Jiro is a young, friendless boy who is upset because all his classmates think he's a weirdo. He is currently venting about his problems and receiving a pep talk, telling him to embrace what's unique about him, but the one giving him this pep talk is his dog. So I kinda see why his friends thought he was weird. It turns out that Jiro was born with the ability to hear the voices of all the animals around him, but talking to animals all the time freaks others out. So by the time Jiro was grown up, the only friends he had were the neighborhood animals, and he'd go to great lengths to keep them safe, even getting into fights to protect some of his animal buddies from the delinquents who were trying to mess with them. After chasing the delinquents off, the cat and crow thank Jiro for his help because those three have been terrorizing them a lot lately, but Jiro says it's no big deal and turns to head home. When he gets back, his grandpa immediately yells at him because he can tell that Jiro got into a fight again. He tells Jiro he didn't teach him the techniques of the shinobi just so he could go around beating people up in the neighborhood. He tells Jiro he's making a mockery of their family name, but Jiro says he couldn't care less about their stupid family name, and that sends his grandpa into a blind rage. So he takes out the family heirloom katana and starts chasing Jiro around. A little while later, the old man finally calms down, so he and Jiro are busy putting the doors back together, but Grandpa's got a community meeting to attend. So he tells Jiro he has to leave and that he will be back late, so he asks Jiro to lock up before going to bed. Jiro curses under his breath but agrees to his request. However, a moment later, that crow from earlier comes looking for Jiro and asks him for help because there's a cat in trouble in the woods. Jiro has no idea what's going on, but he follows the crow, and when he arrives at the location, he finds a cat severely injured under a tree. This is the first time either Jiro or the crow have seen this cat around here, and they have no idea what happened to it, but it looks like it's still breathing, so Jiro decides to do everything he can to save it. It turns out that before this point, the cat was a being known as Rago, the Devourer of the Sun, and he had been summoned by a mysterious group who sought to use his power for themselves. But Rago refused to take orders from them, so his summoners attempted to kill him for it. The next time Rago opens his eyes, he finds himself in a warm cat bed back at Jiro's house, and a moment later, Jiro comes in to check on him. Jiro is glad to see that the cat is finally awake because, with how badly injured it was, he wasn't sure if it would pull through or not. He brought the cat a bowl of water since he assumed it would probably be thirsty, and he then introduces himself, asking the cat to introduce itself as well. Dago thinks Jiro must be an idiot because even if he did tell him his name, there's no way a human would be able to understand the words of a cat, but Jiro tells him it's not nice to call people idiots for no reason. Finding out that Jiro can understand him comes as such a shock to Dago that he runs under the bed and refuses to come out because he doesn't understand what's going on. Jiro can understand why Dago would be startled if he has never spoken to a human before, but he assures him that he's not in any danger here. However, Dago isn't so easily convinced. He doesn't sense any spiritual energy coming from Jiro, so he's sure Jiro really is a human, but just to be safe, he decides to stay hidden there until he can find an opening to escape. However, a moment later, Jiro comes out with some food, and all Dago's earlier caution goes out the window because he's really hungry. Jiro finds it amusing how easy it was to get Rago to cave, but Rago shows no shame and says no hungry man would pass up a meal. Jiro also thinks it's funny that a cat is calling itself a man, but Rago flares up and tells Jiro he is not a cat. He formally introduces himself as an immortal, or what is more commonly known here as a Mononoke. Mononoke often take the forms of humans or animals and blend into their surroundings without people finding out, and Jiro doesn't really get it. But if Mononoke are meant to be such powerful creatures, then he asks how Rago ended up like this in the first place. Rago explains that it was another Mononoke that did this to him, and when Jiro asks why it happened, Rago says he isn't exactly sure of the details because he can't remember everything, but he recalls that it was another Mononoke that did this to him, and the reason they attacked was because they wanted his assistance with something, and he refused. Jiro is starting to understand what went down, because it sounds like, after Rago turned these guys down, they jumped him. Though Jiro doesn't really understand why Rago turned them down in the first place, since he assumed that, as a Mononoke, he would want to help out one of his own. However, Rago says he absolutely hates people like that guy because they are just parasites who want to act tough but can do nothing but rely on the power of others. Rago doesn't really think there's a point in telling Jiro all of this, since, as a human, he probably doesn't believe a word he just said. But Jiro reminds him that he's talking to a kid who has been able to speak to animals all his life, so immortal monsters existing isn't all too surprising to him. Meanwhile, out in the forest, a female agent has just come across the spot where Jiro first found Rago, and she reports back to HQ that she found a pool of blood which she has confirmed belongs to Rago. but she's not picking up any of his spiritual presence, so he must have gone into hiding nearby. Her boss tells her to wait for the rest of the search team to arrive for now, so she agrees to pull back and vanishes into the trees. It looks like there was someone else in the forest looking for traces of Rago besides her. At the same time, back at Jiro's house, he is busy giving Rago a bath to unwind, and he is impressed by how quickly Rago's injuries have all healed because he looks almost as good as new now. Bathing Rago like this reminds Jiro of how he used to do the same with his dog, Nachi, back in the day. She was the biggest, fluffiest dog a guy could ask for, and whenever he would get bullied or hurt, she would always ask him to give her a bath because she knew that always calmed him down. Later that night, Jiro goes to bed, but the second Rago thinks he's asleep, he climbs out onto the windowsill and prepares to leave. He didn't want to have to leave like this since he owes Jiro big time for saving his life, but if he stays here any longer, then he's going to end up putting Jiro in danger. He then jumps out the window, but as he lands, he ends up wobbling a little because although his injuries may have healed, he hasn't regained his full strength yet. He is about to leave the compound, but all of a sudden, Jiro appears behind him and asks Rago where he thinks he's going this late at night. Rago is shocked because he could have sworn he saw Jiro sleeping upstairs, but Jiro had anticipated that Rago might pull something like this, so he set up a dummy illusion in his bed to trick him. Cheap tricks aside, Rago tells him he doesn't need to concern himself with his affairs anymore because he has already done more than enough, but Jiro refuses to accept that and reminds Rago that he's the one who saved his life, so Rago is his responsibility until he is fully recovered. Rago tells Jiro that he never asked him for his help, and in fact, he would have been perfectly fine with dying out there if Jiro hadn't shown up. Jiro keeps arguing with him, but Rago eventually loses patience and reminds Jiro that he is still a Mononoke, a human-eating monster, and it is in Jiro's best interest to just go back to bed and pretend they never met. But all of a sudden, a random guy walks into Jiro's compound and interrupts them. Jiro has no idea who this guy is, but he tells him to get out of here because he wasn't invited. However, the man calls Jiro an ignorant human and transforms his arm before charging at him. This catches Jiro off guard, so he isn't able to react in time. But Rago refuses to let him die like that, so he jumps up and pushes Jiro out of the way before leading the guy out into the forest. He is doing his best to escape, but since he hasn't recovered his strength yet, the demon is easily able to catch up to Rago and pummel him to the ground in no time. He tells Rago that it's not too late to stop and agree to help his side because they put a lot of effort into breaking the seal that kept Rago imprisoned, and they'd hate to have to kill him for not cooperating, but Rago scoffs in his face and tells him that if he wants his power so bad, then he's going to have to risk his life to come get it. The demon then charges at Rago with full force, but before he could hit him, Jiro comes out of nowhere with his family katana and slashes the demon across the arm. Rago can't believe Jiro actually came back and calls him a fool for wasting the opportunity he bought him to escape, but Jiro says he couldn't just leave Rago to die out here to that thing. And besides, if the demon actually did manage to kill Rago, it probably would have come back for Jiro as well, so this was the best option he had. The demon fully transforms and prepares to attack Jiro, but he does find it rather surprising that Jiro isn't fazed at all by his monstrous appearance. He also notices the patterns on the katana and the stealth abilities Jiro showed earlier, and he surmises that Jiro must be one of the shinobi. The demon then charges at him and throws a punch, but although it was sure it had hit him, when it looks at its fist, all it sees is a piece of cloth, because Jiro had actually dodged and was preparing to attack from above. However, while it may have been a good plan, Jiro severely underestimated just how fast the monster really is, because before he could hit it, it had already flashed step behind him and stabbed Jiro through the back with its finger. Jiro attempted to get off one final attack on the demon, but it leapt back to dodge it, and it's impressed that he could even think of attacking with a wound like that, but it doesn't matter now because there's no way Jiro can survive something like that. Rago walks up to Jiro and looks at his dying body with guilt because he knows this would never have happened to Jiro if it weren't for him. But when the demon sees Rago looking at Jiro like that, he assumes he must be thinking about eating him since eating a human would help Rago regain his full power. He agrees to let Rago have Jiro's body in hopes that it will make him change his mind about offering his assistance, but Rago intends to do no such thing. It's true that eating Jiro would allow him to regain his power, but he owes Jiro too much to do that to him or let him die here. So instead, Rago decides to let Jiro eat him. He then transforms and flies into Jiro's body, releasing a large amount of energy as Rago's true power is finally released, and the demon can't believe that Rago would actually betray Mononoke kind like this and hand his power over to a human. Jiro regains consciousness as his wounds are healed with Rago's power, but he has no idea what's going on, and he is startled by all the dark smoke coming out of his body. Just then, he hears Rago's voice in his head, telling him to stop messing around and pay attention because they are still in the middle of a fight. The demon attacks Jiro again, but this time, Jiro's body is fast enough to dodge his attacks, and he manages to avoid being impaled a second time. However, he has no idea how to actually take the demon down. But that's where Rago comes in. He tells Jiro that all he needs to do is make a fist, and he will handle the rest for him. Jiro doesn't really understand what that's supposed to mean, but he goes along with it, and as he throws a punch, Rago uses his energy to blow a hole straight through the demon's torso, killing it in one hit. Jiro is still in disbelief about everything that just happened, but before he could even take a moment to think things through, he is suddenly surrounded by agents from the Espionage Bureau who came here in response to the spiritual disturbance, and he is knocked out so he can be taken in for questioning. The next thing Jiro knows, he finds himself in a hospital bed with the girl who knocked him out standing right next to him, and once she realizes Jiro is awake, she gives a quick call to her chief to let him know Jiro is conscious again. Jiro still has no idea who she is, so he asks what's going on, and Rago pops out of his chest to say he's just as confused as Jiro is right now. Just then, Ichika notices Rago sitting on Jiro's head, and Jiro finally realizes it a moment later, so he starts yelling at Rago to get off him. And a moment later, Ichika's boss finally arrives to check on Jiro. He says he's glad to see that Jiro seems perfectly fine, and he also asks Rago how he's doing, but Rago doesn't feel like talking to him right now. Mild animosity aside, Ryosuke is surprised by how calm Rago is, because he was expecting him to be a lot more confrontational than he is now. Ryosuke introduces himself as the head of the Mononoke division and Ichika as his subordinate, and since Jiro wants an explanation about everything that's going on right now, Ryo decides to start by asking him if he knows about the Oniwaban, and Jiro remembers learning a bit about them. From what he recalls, they were undercover agents who worked for the Edo shogunate, and Ryo adds that as time went on, the Oniwaban moved on from service to the shogunate and now serve the modern government as the Bureau of Espionage. They do a bunch of things, including gathering information, going undercover, and, of course, finding and destroying Mononoke. That's why there's a whole department dedicated to dealing with Mononoke incidents, and Ryo has had it easy for a while since Mononoke usually don't cause much trouble. However, lately, things have been getting really hectic since their facility was attacked by a group of Mononoke, and during that attack, Rago, who was sealed in the facility, was released. All that said, Ryo still isn't sure how exactly Rago and Jiro ended up like that, so he asks Jiro to enlighten him. Jiro explains the whole thing, and Ichika immediately starts calling him an idiot for saving a Mononoke with no plan, but Jiro doesn't want to hear that kind of criticism from someone he doesn't know. Ryo tells Ichika to calm down because the fact of the matter is that Jiro is completely fused with Rago, and unless they do something, he's going to stay that way forever. However, they have no idea how to undo it, and they also have no idea what the other Mononoke may be planning, so Ryo says they'll be taking Jiro into protective custody. Jiro tries to object, but Ryo tells him he doesn't really have a choice in the matter. He clarifies that they aren't heroes of justice or anything like that, so they are under no obligation to preserve Jiro's personal rights. They've already filled out a missing persons report for when they transport Jiro to a different facility tomorrow morning, but for now, Ryo tells him to just get some rest. He also mentions that there are guards stationed outside his door, and he says they are there to protect Jiro in case anything happens, but Jiro knows they are most likely just there to make sure he doesn't escape. Jiro is a little worried since if he gets taken away, there's a good chance he will never get to see his grandpa again. And a situation like this is precisely why Rago kept telling him that getting involved with him would only cause him trouble. Jiro says he really isn't in the mood for a lecture right now, but Rago says he isn't trying to lecture. He just wants Jiro to understand the full picture of what's happening here. Those two may have promised that everything happening right now is for Jiro's protection, but they were also the same people who sealed Rago away in the first place. So Rago finds it hard to believe that they just let Jiro live normally after he has fused with a Mononoke. And on top of that, there's those Mononoke who broke into the facility to release Rago in the first place. If they were willing to cause trouble with the Bureau to get to Rago, they aren't going to give up so easily, so they'll be sure to come after Jiro as well, and that pretty much means Jiro has to figure out what to do on his own. This whole thing has really given Jiro a lot to think about, and he decides he's not going to care about what anyone else says and do what he wants from now on. First things first, he tells Rago they've got to get out of here, and Rago is surprised to hear that because he didn't think Jiro had anywhere to run to at this point. But Jiro says he doesn't plan on running. He just needs to get a few things done, and after that, he's just going to have to accept whatever happens. Rago has no idea what Jiro is thinking, but he warns him that there's no guarantee that everything will be fine if he goes through with this, and he can't rely on Rago to save him. But Jiro says he will figure things out on his own somehow. As he says this, he notices a group of crows outside, and that gives him an idea. So, while the guards are still busy watching the door, he suddenly starts making a lot of noise to draw their attention, and once they come in to check on him, Jiro tells the crows to attack them to buy him enough time to escape. Rago is surprised by how well that worked, but Jiro never had a doubt because those crows are his friends, and if he asks for help, they'll do anything he asks. Once Jiro has made it far enough away from the hospital, he thanks the crows for helping him and gives them a bag of snacks as a reward for their effort. But although Jiro did manage to make it out of the hospital, Rago asks him what he's going to do now since the Bureau is probably already looking for him. Jiro says he really isn't too worried about that right now since there's just one thing he wants to do first. A little while later, Jiro returns to his house, and Rago finally understands why Jiro wanted to escape so badly, because even if the Bureau was going to take him away, he wanted to at least explain things to his grandpa beforehand. After all, he wouldn't want to leave his grandpa thinking that he really did go missing. He stands outside for a while trying to think of how to explain all this to the old man, but all of a sudden, Jiro's grandpa appears behind him, startling Jiro. Jiro begins trying to explain things, but his grandpa tells him to just be quiet and follow him, so that's what Jiro does for now. A little while later, Jiro's grandpa leads him to an open stadium, and Jiro is starting to wonder how much walking they are going to be doing since he really doesn't have much time before the Bureau finds him, and he'd like to talk to his grandpa before that. He also asks why his grandpa brought him to a field in the first place anyway, and his grandpa says he came here so no one else would interfere, right before punching Jiro square in the face. Jiro falls to the ground and asks his grandpa what that was for, but his grandpa simply yells at him and calls him an idiot for not knowing the severity of what he has done. Jiro has no idea what he's talking about, but his grandpa says Ryo already told him everything, including how Jiro is currently possessed by a Mononoke. He probably wouldn't have believed it if he hadn't seen it for himself, but the fact that Rago is right there is definitive proof that the story is true. Jiro is shocked that his grandpa knows about all this stuff, but that's because the old man is a former member of the Bureau of Espionage. He hates that it has come to this, but the old man knows what he must do now. He intends to take responsibility for Jiro's mistake, and to do that, he is going to kill both Jiro and Rago so neither the Bureau nor the Mononoke can exploit them, and after that, he is going to kill himself to atone. Jiro tries to tell his grandpa to calm down, but the old man has nothing more to say, so he charges straight at Jiro with a devastating axe kick. Jiro just barely manages to evade his attack, but he has never seen his grandpa this mad before, and in the next moment, he gets speed blitz and knocked to the ground. His grandpa explains that their Azuma family techniques have been perfected to fight both man and Mononoke alike, but he only ever got to teach Jiro the basics for the sake of self-defense. He thinks it's a shame that Jiro will never get to reach his true potential now, but he wants to ensure that Jiro will never have to suffer the cruelties of the Mononoke world, and to that end, he promises to make Jiro's death as swift and painless as possible. However, just before he could strike Jiro, Rago suddenly steps in and blocks the punch for him, knocking Jiro's grandpa away. Rago tells Jiro to snap out of his daze and take this seriously because his grandpa is really trying to kill him. But despite all that, Jiro still tells Rago to stay out of this and not to come out until he tells him to, because he wants to handle this by himself. Rago doesn't quite understand why Jiro is refusing his help, since he's clearly no match for his grandpa. But if that's what Jiro really wants, then he isn't going to interfere. Looking at Jiro now, his grandpa is reminded of how, when Jiro was younger, he one day climbed into a massive tree just so he could save a baby cat, but he didn't even stop for a second to consider whether he'd be able to get back down on his own after saving it. Luckily, he was there to catch Jiro, but he made sure to yell at him for doing something so reckless, because while helping others may indeed be a noble act, he tells Jiro he's going to end up getting himself killed if he keeps putting himself in situations outside his capabilities. He told Jiro that he needed to learn to rely on those around him instead of trying to solve every problem by himself, but Jiro asks what he's supposed to do if there's no one around to help, and his grandpa told him he'd just have to give up. But Jiro didn't want to live like that, so in that case, his grandpa told him he'd just have to grow stronger so that there's no situation he can't handle. Back to the present, Jiro's grandpa tells him that the world of the Mononoke is like nothing he has ever seen before, and if Jiro were forced into it like his grandpa was, then he'd end up killing his fellow man and Mononoke alike, eventually losing himself in the process. It is a gruesome and unforgiving world, and that's why he fought to make sure Jiro would never have to experience it, but it looks like he failed. Jiro apologizes to his grandpa because he's only in this mess because he stuck his nose where he shouldn't have and didn't think things through, but he says he doesn't regret choosing to help, and he's going to figure out a way to clean up his own mess. His grandpa yells, calling Jiro an ignorant fool before charging at him, and Rago tries to warn Jiro to dodge, but Jiro has no intention of moving. He stands there and takes his grandpa's punch head-on, and though he still gets knocked back, he manages to land on his feet. Rago can't believe Jiro just did that, and his grandpa tells him that was a stupid thing to do because he can tell that he did that in an attempt to demonstrate his resolve, but he says that doesn't prove a thing other than the fact that Jiro can take a punch. Jiro had a feeling that wouldn't be enough to convince his grandpa, but he tells him that, for better or worse, he's not alone anymore. So if he can't do it on his own, he can always rely on Rago. He then tells Rago to do the thing, but Rago has no idea what he's talking about and makes Jiro look stupid for trying to act cool just now, so the two start arguing. Seeing this, his grandpa is reminded of what he told Jiro about finding people he can rely on, and simply by looking at those two, although they may be arguing, he can tell that when push comes to shove, Rago would risk his life to protect Jiro, and Jiro would do the same. This makes him realize that Jiro may actually be able to handle himself after all, so he tells the two of them to stop arguing and announces that he is surrendering, so Jiro is free to do whatever he wants, but he still thinks Jiro is a fool for letting this happen. Later that night, they all return home, and Jiro has a nice long soak in the bath to take the edge off after everything that happened today. He also apologizes to Rago for dragging him into this mess and acting selfishly earlier, but Rago says it doesn't bother him that much. He just asks that Jiro rely on him more so he doesn't end up getting hurt as much next time, and Jiro agrees. Although he's got no idea what they'll have to deal with from now on since he's going to have to work with the Bureau of Espionage starting tomorrow. The next morning, Jiro packs a bag with all of his essentials since he knows the Bureau is going to be here to take him away any minute, and Rago asks him if he's sure about going with them so willingly since he has no way of knowing what they might have in store for him, but Jiro says there's no use in worrying about it now since, with the current situation, it's not like he has much of a choice. Even if he tried to run, the Bureau would just keep chasing him, and dragging his grandpa into all of this again is the last thing he wants, so he figures it's better to face whatever comes next head-on. He then heads out to meet up with the agent the Bureau sent to pick him up, but he is shocked to see that the agent who was sent was actually Ichika, and he really doesn't get along well with her. She says she's here to make sure Jiro doesn't escape again like last time, and she then points to the transport truck, telling Jiro he's going to be riding in the back with her until they get to HQ. Jiro really doesn't like that he's going to be stuck with Ichika, but he doesn't have much of a choice, so he says his final goodbyes to his grandpa and gets in the truck. However, he wasn't expecting handcuffs to be slapped onto his wrists the second he got in with Ichika. He asks her if this is really necessary because there's no need to treat him like a prisoner when he's cooperating, but Ichika tells him he pretty much is a prisoner as far as she's concerned because he's no longer fully human. She honestly has no idea why the higher-ups are so keen on keeping him alive, but her job is to make sure Jiro gets there safe and sound, and she's going to take it seriously, even if it means guarding a freak like Jiro. Jiro really doesn't appreciate being called a freak, especially when he was trying to be nice to Ichika since she's a girl, but Ichika takes offense to that statement because she thinks Jiro is looking down on her, so she punches the wall and threatens Jiro to watch what he says around her. But just then, Rago materializes and asks the two if they could keep it down because he's trying to sleep. But that aside, Rago says he's surprised that the Bureau would send a little girl like Ichika to guard them, and he figures they must really be short-handed if they are sending kids into battle like this. Ichika tells Rago to shut up because she doesn't want to hear any criticisms from a Mononoke, but Rago tells her she has bigger problems to worry about because, although she hasn't realized it yet, they are about to get into a lot of trouble here. As Rago says this, the truck drives into some dense fog, and the two drivers are trying to figure out why it suddenly got so foggy, but then this happens, and the truck crashes shortly after. Ichika and Jiro get flung around in the back of the truck as it crashes, and Ichika has no idea what's going on, but she can tell it isn't good, so she tells Jiro to wait in here while she goes to check it out. As she leaves the truck, she is shocked to find out that they are now in a spectral zone, and she has no idea how she didn't realize it before now. But it's too late to worry about that now because, just then, the two Mononoke show themselves. They've already devoured both drivers, and they are clearly after Rago, so Ichika equips her gear and prepares to take them down. First, she tries using good old reliable, a gun, but unfortunately, bullets have no effect on the big guy, and the smaller one is too fast for her to shoot, so she is forced to switch to her melee weapon to defend herself. The small one knocks her backward into the big one, but Ichika manages to reposition herself with her knife and slash across the big one's arms as she dodges its punch. However, even though she was able to slash it multiple times, none of the slashes went very deep because its body is extremely dense. She realizes she's not going to be able to damage that one with the weapons she has on hand right now, and the other one's speed is a real problem as well because the second Ichika gets distracted, it sneaks up behind her and smacks her into the side of the truck. Jiro sees the dent from inside, and he wonders what's going on out there since he thought they were just meant to be heading to the bureau. But Rago explains that Ichika is probably getting attacked by a Mononoke right now, and by the sound of things out there, she's getting her ass beaten. Jiro is surprised and asks how that's possible, so Rago explains that while he and Ichika were arguing, the truck must have slipped into a spectral zone. Jiro doesn't know what spectral zones are, so Rago explains that it's pretty much a dimension entirely separate from the mortal world, otherwise known as the realm of the Mononoke. He adds that humans can sometimes wander into one by accident, but getting out isn't always easy once they've crossed over. Jiro still doesn't really get it, but it doesn't matter right now because, from the sound of things out there, Ichika is going to die if he doesn't do something to help her soon, so he asks Rago to help him get these handcuffs off. However, Rago says he can't do that. Those handcuffs are made of a special material that negates all spiritual energy, so Rago isn't capable of destroying them in his current state. Jiro is starting to get really frustrated, so he decides he's just going to go out there and force Ichika to take the handcuffs off him herself so he can help. However, Rago tells him he might be better off just letting it play out. After all, just like the Mononoke, the Bureau is simply trying to take him so they can use him for their own personal gain, so it would be in his best interest to just let them keep fighting and escape while he can. Rago's reasoning makes sense, but at the end of the day, the facts of the matter are that Ichika is currently fighting to protect Jiro, even if it's just because of orders, and Jiro isn't the kind of guy who'd just sit by and watch someone die protecting him, even if she's pretty rude, so he's going to help her. Just then, the big Mononoke ends up punching the van, which sends Jiro flying out onto the grass, and when the Mononoke see him, they recognize Jiro as the target they were sent here to collect. Their orders are to bring him back alive, so they tell him that if he surrenders, they won't hurt him. But Jiro completely ignores them and starts yelling at Ichika to hurry up and unlock these handcuffs so he can help, but to his surprise, she refuses because she says she'd never want to work with a Mononoke like him. Just then, the two Mononoke attack, so Jiro and Ichika are forced to dodge backward, and Jiro tells Ichika to get over her petty bias and let him help because if she doesn't, they're both going to end up dying here. As he says this, Ichika is reminded of the day they held her mother's funeral after she died at the hands of a Mononoke, and from that day on, Ichika swore she would do everything in her power to become strong, just like her mother would have wanted. She wants to believe she can handle this on her own, but the reality is that she can't, and Jiro tells her that if she doesn't want her mission to end in failure, then she has to be willing to do whatever it takes to win, even if that means working with him. She hesitates for a brief moment, knowing everything she has believed since childhood is telling her to refuse, but she also knows Jiro is right. Ichika finally agrees to let Jiro help and shatters his handcuffs, and the second Jiro is free, he leaps into the air and calls on Rago for some help, allowing him to one-shot the big Mononoke, and while the other one was frozen in disbelief at the death of its friend, Ichika snuck up behind it and diced it into pieces. But unfortunately, Jiro jumped a little too high with that first jump, so he ends up crashing to the ground. When he gets back up, Ichika stands off to the side and tells him she's not going to be thanking him for this, but Jiro says he didn't do it for any thanks. Ichika fought to protect him, so he did the same for her, and that makes them even, and this whole thing has made Ichika's opinion of Jiro a lot better. However, they still have a bit of a problem to deal with since the transport truck was destroyed, so Jiro asks Ichika what they are supposed to do now, and Ichika tells him they are just going to have to walk the rest of the way. Meanwhile, Ryosuke is currently in a meeting with the higher-ups, and he is basically trying to convince them to allow him to establish a team with Jiro and Rago as members. The council members think that's a terrible idea at first, but Ryo explains that Rago has yet to show any hostility toward them, and he seems to be cooperating with Jiro at the moment, so it should be possible to work with him. Additionally, it's pretty clear that the enemy is after him, so rather than condemning Jiro and Rago to a cell, he thinks it'd be better if they get the chance to work in the field and sharpen their skills, so the enemy won't be able to snatch them up so easily. He also points out that keeping Jiro locked away won't solve anything because their enemies will continue targeting him regardless, and if that happens, it'd be better for Jiro to have actual combat experience instead of spending all his time behind bars. Ryo also promises to take full responsibility for what happens to Jiro and Rago from now on, and his proposal was rather persuasive, so the higher-ups agree to let him do what he wants. The next day, Jiro is out by the dock brushing his teeth, thinking about how crazy the past week was because one moment he was just living a normal life, but the next thing he knew, he found a weird cat, got killed by a giant ogre, and now here he is, working for a strange organization. Just then, Ryo comes over to ask Jiro how he's adjusting to his new life. But Jiro doesn't think this is much of a new life since they've already run all sorts of tests on him since he got here, and he hasn't had a single minute to himself yet. And on top of that, he still can't believe that this is really the base of operations that Ryo was talking about. Ryo explains that every division in the Bureau has its own base of operations, and it has to blend in with the surroundings, so they usually opt for office buildings or shrines and stuff, but unfortunately, the second division got stuck with a shipping yard, and since Jiro is one of them now, that means he's stuck with it too. Just then, a car pulls up to the base, and a young woman gets out, so Jiro asks who this is, and Ryo explains that this is Hana Usumi, and she is going to be the assistant chief of this team, and the other guy who gets out of the car and immediately starts flirting with Usami is Reiji Kirihara. Ryo formally introduces everyone inside, and he hopes they'll all get along, but Jiro and Ichika still don't get along very well. Reiji, on the other hand, is a master of conversation, and within a few minutes of talking to Ichika, he manages to compliment her so much that she starts blushing. However, when it comes to Jiro, he has nothing but unfiltered disgust for a half-human, half-Mononoke hybrid like him, and Jiro isn't the kind of person who just sit there and let himself be insulted, so he gets up in Reiji's face and asks him if he's looking for a fight, and Reiji says he'd love to beat Jiro up if that's what he wants. Ichika tries calming things down since she doesn't want these two to actually get into a fight, but Ryo, on the other hand, is more than happy to see the fight happen, and he even gets Usami to pull out a camera so they can record it. Aside from thinking this would be fun to watch, Ryo is also doing it because they still need to test what Jiro's limits are and how strong he really is. Otherwise, they won't be able to make effective use of him in the field. Usami then begins the recording, and Ryo gives the signal for them to start fighting. This was the end of episode 3. Subscribe to not miss the next part.